When new nurse Emma Collins starts her rounds at Glenview Medical, she meets Mildred, a quiet, elderly woman with an unspoken sadness. Emma soon senses that something is wrong. Mildred's care has been neglected, and subtle signs point to a system failing its most vulnerable. Driven by her compassion, Emma decides to act, but she quickly finds herself facing unexpected resistance, even from those she thought she could trust. As Emma digs deeper, she must risk her career and her peace of mind to defend a patient no one else seems to see. Will her courage be enough to bring change, or will she be silenced? Before we jump in, tell us in the comments if you think one voice can really make a difference. And if you enjoy stories of bravery and kindness, don't forget to subscribe for more like this. Now, let's begin Emma's journey. The morning was quiet, save for the hum of traffic beyond the hospital walls. Emma Collins moved through Glenview Medical's hallways with a brisk but careful pace, the soles of her shoes squeaking softly on the waxed floors. She was 24, newly certified, and one of the youngest on her team. Although she had faced the nerves and excitement of other first-time nurses, Emma's compassion and warmth stood out. She made it her goal to provide comfort to each patient, regardless of the chaotic pace around her. Emma's blue scrubs, freshly ironed, gave her a neat appearance, though her gaze often betrayed the sympathy she felt for each patient. After a few nods and exchanges with her colleagues, she checked the morning assignments. Her list held a few familiar names, along with one new addition: Mildred Grant, room 306. The elderly woman was recovering from a recent fall and was in need of ongoing monitoring. As Emma made her way to room 306, she noted how empty the halls felt this early in the morning. The sun barely filtered through the windows, casting long, somber shadows that seemed to reach out across the floor. Emma arrived at Mildred's door, knocking lightly before stepping inside. "Good morning, Mrs. Grant," she greeted softly, her voice warm but professional. In the bed lay Mildred, an elderly African-American woman with fragile features and large, expressive eyes that told their own story. Her posture was slightly hunched, and her face wore an expression of both relief and weariness as she looked up at Emma. "Hello, dear," Mildred replied, her voice low and tinged with age. Emma noted the faint yellow stain on the front of Mildred's gown and a subtle odor that hinted at neglect rather than a mere accident. She suppressed a frown, keeping her expression kind and unbothered. "Looks like we'll get you into a fresh gown, okay?" she suggested, her voice soft as she collected the needed supplies. Mildred nodded but seemed hesitant, her hands trembling as she attempted to push herself upright. Emma quickly moved to support her, helping her shift gently to one side. "It's all right," she murmured, gently easing the fabric of the soiled gown from her shoulders. But as she helped Mildred, she couldn't ignore the way the older woman's gaze dropped, as if ashamed. Mildred's silence troubled Emma, and she watched the older woman's trembling hands, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of her struggle. As Emma reached for a clean gown, she found herself wondering about Mildred's time here. How often did someone spend a moment with her, not just as a patient, but as a person in need of understanding and companionship? "Is everything all right, Mrs. Grant?" Emma asked, her voice gentle. She wanted to encourage Mildred to share if something was troubling her, but she wasn't sure if the woman was ready to open up. Mildred's lips parted, as though she were about to speak, but then she shook her head and gave Emma a wan smile. "It's fine, sweetheart. Don't you worry about me." Emma wasn't entirely convinced, but she respected Mildred's choice to stay quiet. Instead, she made sure to smooth the sheets and adjust Mildred's pillows with extra care, hoping that these small gestures might convey her concern and respect. With a smile, she said, "You just let me know if you need anything, okay?" The elderly woman's eyes softened, and she nodded, giving Emma's hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you, dear. You're very kind." After her initial rounds, Emma's thoughts kept returning to Mildred. The quiet dignity in Mildred's eyes, coupled with the trembling of her hands, lingered in Emma's mind. There was a subtle fragility to her that Emma couldn't ignore. She decided to ask a few colleagues about Mildred, hoping to better understand the elderly woman's condition and her experience at Glenview. At the nurse's station, Emma leaned toward Carla, a senior nurse known for her straightforward manner. "Carla, do you know anything about Mildred Grant in room 306? She asked. Carla glanced at her, a slight frown creasing her brow. "She's been here a while," she said with a shrug. "Recovering from a fall, I think. Not an easy case. Sometimes patients her age have a hard time adjusting, you know." Emma nodded, but something about Carla's response left her feeling unsatisfied. "Has she had many visitors?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Carla shook her head. "Not that I know of. Family doesn't seem to visit often, if at all." Emma felt a pang of sadness for Mildred, imagining the long, lonely days she must spend in that quiet room. "Thanks, Carla," she murmured, offering a faint smile before heading back to her station. As Emma continued her shift, she noticed a figure walking out of room B. 306. It was Dr. Andrew Keene, one of the hospital's senior doctors. He was known for his no-nonsense approach, which often bordered on aloofness. Emma had only briefly interacted with him during her training, but she remembered his direct, almost clinical manner. As Dr. Keene walked past, Emma caught a glimpse of his face, a faint scowl, as if something had displeased him. She couldn't be certain, but there was an unsettling sense of indifference in his expression. When she peeked into Mildred's room afterward, she saw the woman sitting in bed, her gaze fixed on the window, her hands clenching the edge of her blanket. Mildred's face looked strained, her eyes holding a distant, weary expression that tugged at Emma's heart. "Are you doing okay, Mrs. Grant?" she asked softly. Mildred gave a small nod, her eyes still averted. "I'm all right, dear," she replied, though her tone lacked its earlier warmth. Emma felt a prickle of worry. Something was wrong, but she wasn't sure what. She decided she would check on Mildred more frequently, hoping that over time she might earn the woman's trust enough to uncover the source of her discomfort. The next day, Emma found herself heading to Mildred's room earlier than usual, her curiosity and concern urging her forward. She knocked gently and entered, finding Mildred sitting up in bed, her gaze distant. "Good morning, Mrs. Grant," Emma greeted her, settling into the routine of checking her vitals and adjusting her pillows. "How did you sleep?" Mildred looked up, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It was all right. You know, these walls start to feel smaller each day." Emma chuckled softly, hoping to lift her spirits. "Well, you're getting better each day, too," she said, a note of encouragement in her voice. Mildred sighed, her smile faltering. "Thank you, dear, but sometimes it's hard to feel hopeful." She hesitated, her gaze drifting back toward the window, as if searching for something just beyond reach. Emma felt a surge of empathy. She wanted to reassure Mildred that she wasn't alone, that she had someone who cared, but she knew it would take time. Instead, she reached out, placing a gentle hand over Mildred's. "I'm here if you ever need to talk." The elderly woman's hand trembled slightly beneath Emma's, but her grip tightened, her fingers wrapping around Emma's with a quiet strength. "Thank you," Mildred whispered, her eyes glistening. "You have no idea how much that means to me." Emma smiled softly, squeezing her hand before releasing it. She glanced over at the nightstand, noticing a small, faded photograph of a young woman with a wide, bright smile. Mildred followed her gaze and let out a soft sigh. "That's my daughter," Mildred said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "She passed some years ago. I suppose it's just me now." Emma felt a pang in her chest, the weight of Mildred's loneliness pressing down on her. She could see now how deeply the woman craved connection, how years of loss and solitude had left her vulnerable. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Grant," she said quietly, her heart aching for the woman's pain. Mildred gave her a small, grateful smile, a spark of warmth returning to her eyes. "You're a good soul, Emma. Don't lose that." As Emma left the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would do everything she could to bring comfort to Mildred, and perhaps, in some small way, ease the loneliness that had settled over her like a shadow. Emma kept a close watch on Mildred over the next few days, making sure to check in on her whenever she had a spare moment. Despite the hospital's busy atmosphere, she made a point of spending time with the elderly woman. sensing that Mildred looked forward to their brief interactions. One afternoon, during her lunch break, Emma stopped by Mildred's room. She knocked quietly before stepping in, and her heart sank at the sight before her. Mildred was staring at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. Her face looked tense, and her normally bright eyes were clouded with something akin to fear. Emma noticed how Mildred's fingers gripped the blanket, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Grant," Emma said softly, closing the door behind her. She moved to sit beside the bed, trying to offer a comforting presence. "Is everything okay?" Mildred didn't respond at first, as though debating whether she should confide in Emma. Finally, she looked up, her gaze wavering. "Emma, I don't want to trouble you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma leaned in, her voice gentle. "You're not troubling me at all. I'm here to help, however I can." After a long pause, Mildred sighed. "Sometimes, certain people here treat me in a way that makes me feel like I'm a burden. I know they're busy, but I'm still a person." Emma's stomach tightened as she absorbed Mildred's words. She thought of Dr. Keene's cool detachment, the way he seemed to view patients like Mildred as little more than tasks to be completed. She didn't want to assume the worst, but the uneasy feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Grant," Emma said, keeping her voice steady. "No one should make you feel that way." Mildred nodded, her lips pressing together. "Thank you, Emma. You're a kind soul. Not everyone here takes the time to listen." Emma's heart ached for the elderly woman, and she felt her own frustration growing. She gave Mildred's hand a reassuring squeeze before leaving, determined to find a way to ensure her patient received the respect and care she deserved. Later that evening, as Emma was finishing her shift, she saw Dr. Keene speaking with one of the senior nurses at the end of the hallway. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before approaching them. "Dr. Keene?" Emma called, doing her best to sound polite and professional. "Doctor?" Keene turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Nurse Collins?" Emma hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I've been caring for Mrs. Mildred Grant in room 306, and I wanted to discuss her treatment plan." "Doctor?" Keene's gaze narrowed slightly, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. "Is there an issue with her care?" Emma kept her tone calm. "It's more about her comfort, sir. I feel she could benefit from additional support, both physically and emotionally. She's expressed feeling overlooked at times." "Doctor?" Keene's expression hardened, and his voice took on a sterner edge. "Nurse Collins, I would suggest focusing on your own duties. You're here to follow the care plan that I've established, not to question it." Emma felt a chill at his tone, but forced herself to stay calm. "Of course, Dr. Keene, I just thought it might help to consider her comfort a bit more." "Doctor?" Keene gave her a tight smile, his tone dripping with condescension. "Nurse Collins, perhaps you're unfamiliar with our hospital's priorities, but we have to manage our time and resources carefully. Not every patient requires or deserves the same attention." His words stung, and Emma's hands clenched involuntarily. She bit back a retort, sensing that further resistance would only worsen the situation. Instead, she nodded, managing a stiff smile. "Understood, doctor," she replied, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment well up inside her. As she walked away, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Keene's dismissal was just the surface of a larger issue. She felt as though she'd been warned, a subtle reminder of her place in the hierarchy. But it only strengthened her resolve. Mildred deserved better, and Emma was determined to find a way to advocate for her. The next day, Emma went about her rounds with a new awareness. She began to notice small details she hadn't focused on before. How some of the more vulnerable patients seemed withdrawn, or how certain nurses moved swiftly from one task to the next, barely sparing a glance at their patients. It was as though an unspoken culture of detachment had taken hold among parts of the staff, prioritizing efficiency over compassion. Emma tried to find allies, quietly reaching out to some of her colleagues to discuss her concerns. But each conversation ended in vague reassurances, a quick brush-off, or subtle warnings to avoid questioning the system. She could sense the discomfort in their responses, the way they avoided meeting her gaze too directly. After one particularly discouraging conversation, she confided in her friend and fellow nurse, Sarah, who had started at Glenview around the same time. Sarah was known for her gentle demeanor, and Emma trusted her completely. "Sarah," Emma whispered during a rare moment in the break room, "I don't know what to do. I feel like something's wrong here, especially with how Dr. Keene handles certain patients." Sarah looked at her sympathetically but hesitated. "Emma, I know you mean well, but Dr. Keene has been here for years. He has a lot of influence, and I think you should be careful." Emma frowned. "Do you think I'm overreacting?" Sarah sighed, looking thoughtful. "It's not that, Emma. You have a good heart. But this place? It's complicated. Sometimes things aren't as simple as they seem. Just be cautious, okay?" Emma appreciated Sarah's advice, but she felt more determined than ever. Caution, she knew, could be wise, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that Mildred, and perhaps others, needed her support. As the day wore on, Emma's frustration grew. She watched Dr. Keene go about his rounds, his face impassive, his interactions with patients and staff brisk and efficient. She couldn't reconcile his cold demeanor with her vision of patient care. Toward the end of her shift, she found herself alone with him in a quiet hallway. Emma took a deep breath and approached him. "Dr. Keene," she said, her voice steady, "I wanted to revisit our conversation about Mrs. Grant. I believe there are aspects of her care plan that could be improved." "Doctor?" Keene's expression remained neutral, but his eyes flashed with a warning. "Nurse Collins, we have already discussed this. Perhaps you need a reminder about the structure here. I am the doctor, and you are the nurse. It's your role to support my decisions, not question them." Emma felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to stay calm. "I understand, doctor, but I can't help feeling that Mrs. Grant and patients like her deserve more." For a moment, a flicker of irritation crossed Dr. Keene's face. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and controlled. "Consider this your last warning, Nurse Collins. Focus on your own responsibilities. If you persist, there will be consequences." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing in the empty hallway, her heart pounding. The weight of his threat hung heavily over her, but she couldn't shake the conviction that she was doing the right thing. She had vowed to be an advocate for her patients, to bring them the care and comfort they deserved. And now, more than ever, she felt compelled to stand by that promise. A few days later, during an unusually quiet afternoon, Emma returned to Mildred's room with a new blanket and some extra water, hoping the small comforts would lift her spirits. She knocked gently and stepped in to find Mildred gazing out the window, her expression distant. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Grant," Emma greeted softly, placing the fresh blanket over Mildred's legs. "Thought you might like a warmer one." Mildred looked up, her eyes brightening slightly at Emma's thoughtfulness. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice tinged with appreciation. But there was a weariness in her gaze that Emma couldn't ignore. "Mrs. Grant, is everything truly okay? If there's anything you're uncomfortable with, I'm here to listen," Emma offered, her tone gentle. Mildred hesitated, looking down at her hands as if wrestling with something unspoken. Finally, she took a shaky breath and spoke in a low voice. "Sometimes I wonder if people here really see me. It's as though I'm just an old woman taking up space." Emma felt a pang in her chest. She reached out, giving Mildred's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're not just a patient, Mrs. Grant. You're a person, and you deserve care and respect. I'll make sure you get that." Mildred's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. "I wish everyone thought like you do, Emma. I feel safer when you're here." Emma returned the smile, touched by Mildred's words. She left the room with renewed resolve, promising herself she'd find a way to ensure that Mildred, and others like her, received the dignity and compassion they deserved. Later that afternoon, as Emma updated patient charts at the nurse's station, she overheard a conversation that caught her attention. Dr. Keene was speaking with a nurse down the hall, his voice low but distinct enough for her to catch snippets of their discussion. "Need to prioritize resources," he was saying in his typical matter-of-fact tone. "Some patients contribute more than others, and we must be selective in our care. We're running a hospital, not a charity." Emma felt her stomach twist. While Dr. Keene's words weren't overtly cruel, the implication was unmistakable. Some patients, like Mildred, didn't warrant his attention because of their age or health status. His casual dismissal of certain patients as less worthy was infuriating. Steeling herself, Emma glanced around and discreetly took notes on the conversation in a small pocket journal she kept for her own observations. It wasn't much, but she felt that gathering even small bits of evidence could help her make a case if she needed to escalate her concerns. The next day, Emma crossed paths with Dr. Keene in the hallway. She felt a mixture of nerves and resolve as she approached him, hoping to address her concerns in a respectful but direct manner. "Dr. Keene," she began, keeping her tone neutral, "I've been reflecting on some of our patients' needs, particularly those who might feel overlooked. I think we could work on fostering a more supportive environment, especially for patients like Mrs. Grant." Dr. Keene's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Nurse Collins," he replied, his tone cool, "I understand your desire to go above and beyond, but your role is to follow the directives I've put in place. Patients are prioritized based on their conditions and the resources available." Emma felt a surge of frustration, but kept her voice steady. "I understand, doctor, but surely a bit of kindness and attention can be factored in too. It's important to make all our patients feel valued." "Doctor?" Keene's gaze turned steely, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Be careful, Nurse Collins. It's easy for someone in your position to let emotions interfere with the practicalities of care. If you continue this insubordination, I'll have to bring it to the administration's attention." Emma felt a flush of anger but nodded, not wanting to push her luck further. As she walked away, she felt more determined than ever to do right by her patients, even if it meant standing alone. Emma spent the next few days gathering small bits of evidence wherever she could. She documented her observations in her journal, each dismissive comment she overheard, each subtle indication of neglect in Mildred's care. But despite her careful approach, she couldn't ignore the growing anxiety in her chest. The reality of Dr. Keene's threat loomed over her, and she knew that challenging him could jeopardize her career. One evening, she confided in Sarah again, feeling the weight of her frustration and worry. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," Emma admitted, her voice tinged with despair. "Every time I try to advocate for Mildred, I feel like I'm hitting a wall. I'm afraid that if I go to administration, it'll just be brushed aside. Or worse, used against me." Sarah placed a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, you're one of the most compassionate nurses here. You're doing the right thing by standing up for your patients, but I also think you should protect yourself. Maybe there's a way to bring attention to this without putting yourself directly in the line of fire?" Emma considered Sarah's suggestion, feeling a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was a way to escalate her concerns more discreetly, to get the administration to notice without making herself a target. Inspired by Sarah's advice, Emma decided to take a slightly different approach. She began leaving anonymous notes in the suggestion box, a small, nondescript box in the break room where staff could leave feedback for the administration. Her notes were brief but pointed, each one describing specific instances of negligence or lack of compassion toward certain patients. She watched the box for days, hoping her notes would catch someone's attention. But as the days turned into weeks, her frustration grew. It seemed as though the box was more a formality than an actual means of change. Yet Emma refused to give up. One afternoon, she found herself once again in Mildred's room, adjusting her pillows and chatting about everyday things to lift her spirits. But as Emma helped her sip some water, Mildred looked at her with a sadness that went deeper than physical discomfort. "You're a rare one, Emma," Mildred murmured, her voice soft. "You're the only one who's made me feel like I matter here." Emma felt her throat tighten, guilt and anger swirling within her. "You do matter, Mrs. Grant. More than anything, you deserve kindness and respect." Mildred gave a faint smile, her frail hand reaching out to rest on Emma's. It's a blessing to know people like you are out there. Don't lose that heart of yours." Emma's heart ached. She knew she couldn't let this go. Mildred, and patients like her, deserved better. She decided then and there that she would escalate her concerns, even if it meant risking her position at the hospital. Emma knew it was time to go beyond subtle notes in the suggestion box. After weeks of collecting details and hearing Mildred's stories, she was determined to bring her concerns to someone in authority. But her attempts at discreet documentation had shown her that her words alone might not be enough. She needed an ally in the administration, someone who could lend weight to her claims. One morning, Emma decided to approach Dr. Susan Hayes, a new addition to the medical team and someone she had occasionally worked with in patient care. Dr. Hayes had a reputation for her compassionate, patient-centered approach, and Emma had often seen her spend extra time with elderly patients, ensuring they felt heard. Emma caught up with Dr. Hayes in the break room. "Dr. Hayes," she began, her voice low but earnest, "do you have a moment? I'd like to discuss a patient. Well, a few patients, really." Dr. Hayes looked up from her notes, her expression attentive. "Of course, Emma. Let's sit." As they sat down, Emma carefully relayed some of her concerns, describing the issues with patient neglect and the dismissive treatment that she had observed, especially regarding Mildred. Dr. Hayes listened closely, her brows furrowing as Emma described Dr. Keene's behavior and her frustration with the administration's lack of response. "I've been trying to advocate for them, but it feels like an uphill battle," Emma said, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm worried that patients like Mrs. Grant are being overlooked, even harmed, by indifference." Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Emma, I understand your concern, and I've noticed a certain pattern myself. If we approach this carefully, perhaps we can bring it to the attention of the administration. But I want to make sure you're prepared for possible resistance." Emma felt a rush of relief. Finally, someone understood. "I'm ready for it, Dr. Hayes. I just want to see real change, even if it's gradual." Dr. Hayes placed a reassuring hand on Emma's arm. "I'll help however I can. Let's schedule a meeting with the administration to discuss our findings. Together, I think we'll have a stronger chance." The day of the meeting arrived quickly, and Emma found herself filled with a mix of nervous energy and determination. She and Dr. Hayes sat across from the hospital's director, Mrs. Carol Whitman, a woman known for her strict adherence to policies and the bottom line. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself as Dr. Hayes began the discussion. "Mrs. Whitman," Dr. Hayes started, "we've noticed some issues regarding patient care, particularly with vulnerable patients. There's a concern that certain patients might be receiving less than adequate attention." Mrs. Whitman raised an eyebrow, her gaze turning to Emma. "I understand you've been vocal about these concerns, Nurse Collins. Could you be specific?" Emma swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "There have been instances where patients, particularly elderly ones, expressed feeling overlooked or even neglected. I believe that the hospital could do more to ensure these patients feel respected and well cared for." Mrs. Whitman's expression remained unreadable. "We operate under strict protocols, Nurse Collins. Our staff is expected to follow those guidelines efficiently. Is there something specific you're asking for?" Emma exchanged a glance with Dr. Hayes before continuing. "Yes, actually, I'd like to request a review of certain care practices, particularly those involving patients who may require additional attention. I believe a more patient-centered approach could make a significant difference." Mrs. Whitman's mouth tightened slightly, and she leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You're suggesting that our staff is negligent?" "No," Emma replied, maintaining her composure. "I'm suggesting that we could do better. Some patients, like Mrs. Grant, have shared experiences that suggest they're not receiving the compassionate care they deserve. I believe this is something we can improve on." Mrs. Whitman remained silent for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. Finally, she nodded. "I'll consider your proposal. But understand, Nurse Collins, that any changes in procedure would require substantial justification. Hospitals operate on limited resources, and we must be practical in our priorities. Emma forced a polite nod, trying to contain her frustration. It wasn't the response she had hoped for, but it was at least a small step forward. Dr. Hayes gave her a reassuring smile as they left the office together. Despite the glimmer of hope, Emma's relief was short-lived. Over the next week, she noticed subtle changes in her work environment. A few senior nurses began treating her with a slight coolness, and there were whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. It was clear that her reputation was being affected by her recent actions. Emma tried to focus on her duties, but she couldn't ignore the feeling of isolation that had begun to settle over her. She felt like an outsider, someone who was viewed as disruptive rather than helpful. Even her interactions with Dr. Keene had taken on a tense, guarded tone. One afternoon, as Emma was gathering supplies, she overheard a couple of colleagues talking near the supply closet. Their words were soft but unmistakable. "She's taking it too far, honestly. Going up against Dr. Keene? Does she really think anything's going to change?" Emma felt her heart sink. She had hoped that speaking up would inspire others, but it seemed that her efforts were only alienating her from the very people she wanted to encourage. Later that day, Sarah approached her with a concerned expression. "Emma, I heard what happened with the administration. I think you're doing the right thing, but just be careful. I don't want you to lose your job over this." Emma gave her a faint smile, grateful for her friend's support. "Thanks, Sarah. I know it's a risk, but I feel like I have to keep trying. Patients like Mrs. Grant deserve better." Sarah nodded, but Emma could see the worry in her eyes. It was a reminder that she was navigating a difficult path, one that could have real consequences. The discouraging atmosphere didn't deter Emma's commitment to her patients. In fact, it only strengthened her resolve. Every time she visited Mildred, she was reminded of the reason she had chosen to speak out in the first place. Mildred's warm smile, her quiet resilience, these were the things that fueled Emma's determination to make a difference. One evening, Emma sat beside Mildred's bed, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the uphill battle she faced. "Mrs. Grant, I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to make sure you receive the best care," she said softly, her voice filled with conviction. Mildred looked at her with a gentle smile. "Emma, you've done more for me than anyone else here. Just knowing that someone cares, it makes all the difference." Emma felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and she blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. "You deserve respect and kindness, Mrs. Grant, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you get that." As she left Mildred's room that night, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was committed to fighting for change, even if it meant standing alone. One afternoon, Emma was heading down the corridor toward the supply room when she overheard voices from Mildred's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear Dr. Keene's voice, his tone cold and dismissive. Emma's steps slowed as she listened, her heart pounding. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but the fragments of conversation were enough to hold her back. I'm here to manage resources, Mrs. Grant, not to indulge every little complaint," Dr. Keene was saying, his voice low but laced with impatience. Emma could only imagine the expression on Mildred's face. She felt a surge of anger at his dismissive tone, but she remained silent, listening intently. "There are patients with more urgent needs," Dr. Keene continued. "Your time here is a courtesy, and I'd suggest making the most of it without further demands." A moment later, she heard his footsteps as he walked toward the door. Emma stepped back quickly, moving down the hall to avoid being seen. Her mind was racing. She couldn't stand by and allow this treatment to continue, not after everything Mildred had endured. With renewed determination, she decided to speak to Dr. Hayes once more, hoping her ally would be willing to take stronger action now that they had witnessed Dr. Keene's behavior firsthand. Emma found Dr. Hayes later that day and described the encounter she'd overheard. Dr. Hayes listened, her expression growing more serious with every word. When Emma finished, Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "I've been noticing this pattern too," Dr. Hayes admitted.
Dr.
Keene seems to prioritize patients based on his own criteria rather than what they genuinely need. This is something we can't ignore anymore. Emma felt a surge of hope. Do you think we could escalate this? Maybe involve someone outside the hospital? Dr. Hayes considered her words. It's a possibility, but there's a risk. Doctor? Keene has been with this hospital for a long time, and he's well connected. However, I think we have enough documentation to make a strong case if we present this properly. Over the next few days, Emma and Dr. Hayes carefully compiled their findings. They created a file with testimonies, documented interactions, and specific instances of dismissive treatment, building a compelling case to present to the hospital board. Emma's nervousness mixed with a sense of justice, knowing that this action could finally bring about the change she'd been hoping for. With the support of Dr. Hayes, Emma felt ready to approach Dr. Keene directly, hoping to give him an opportunity to address his behavior before they escalated the matter. She found him in his office, and after a deep breath, she knocked on the door and stepped inside. Dr. Keene looked up, his expression unreadable. Yes, Nurse Collins? I trust this is important. Emma kept her voice steady. Dr. Keene, I wanted to discuss some concerns I have about your approach to patient care, specifically with regard to patients like Mrs. Grant. Dr. Keene's expression hardened. Is that so? He replied, a hint of condescension in his tone. And what exactly are your concerns? Emma took a steadying breath. I believe your interactions with certain patients have been less than compassionate. I've overheard remarks that seem to undermine their dignity. Patients like Mrs. Grant deserve to feel respected and cared for. Dr. Keene's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk forming on his face. Nurse Collins, you're stepping into dangerous territory. I've been at this hospital long enough to know which patients truly need my attention. Perhaps your inexperience is clouding your judgment. Emma felt a surge of frustration but maintained her composure. With all due respect, Doctor, kindness and respect should be extended to every patient, regardless of age or perceived contribution. It's part of our duty as healthcare professionals. Doctor? Keene's expression shifted, his demeanor growing colder. Let me remind you, Nurse Collins, that you are here to follow orders, not to question them. Any further insubordination could have serious consequences for your career. Emma's heart pounded, but she didn't waver. I understand the risks, Dr. Keene, but I can't ignore this any longer. The hospital administration deserves to know the full extent of your treatment toward these patients. For a moment, Dr. Keene looked taken aback, his mask of calm slipping. But then, his face hardened once more. Do what you must, Nurse Collins. But remember, you're risking everything on the word of a few elderly patients. Emma met his gaze unflinchingly, her resolve stronger than ever. It's a risk I'm willing to take, Dr. Keene. A week later, Emma and Dr. Hayes were granted a meeting with the hospital's board of directors. The room was filled with senior administrators, each one listening intently as Emma and Dr. Hayes presented their case. Emma spoke clearly and calmly, detailing the instances she had documented and the encounters she had witnessed. Dr. Hayes backed her up, presenting the ethical concerns surrounding Dr. Keene's behavior and the impact it had on patient care. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and contemplation. Finally, one of the directors leaned forward, addressing Emma directly. This is a serious accusation, Nurse Collins. Are you certain of everything you've presented here? Emma nodded, her voice steady. Yes, I am. I've spent months observing and documenting these issues. Our patients deserve compassion and respect, and I believe it's our duty to uphold those standards. The director nodded, looking thoughtful. We'll be conducting an internal investigation into this matter, effective immediately. Thank you, Nurse Collins, Dr. Hayes. Your commitment to patient care is commendable. As Emma and Dr. Hayes left the boardroom, Emma felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew it wasn't over, but she was grateful for the opportunity to speak up and for the board's willingness to listen. A few weeks later, the results of the internal investigation were announced. Dr. Keene was placed on administrative leave pending further review. The news spread quickly through the hospital, with staff members exchanging quiet whispers and relieved glances. Emma couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. While she was relieved that action had been taken, she also knew this wasn't an easy victory. Challenging someone as influential as Dr. Keene had taken a toll, and she was grateful for Dr. Hayes's support throughout the process. One afternoon, Emma was making her rounds when she ran into Sarah. Her friend offered a warm smile and a supportive hug. "You did it, Emma. You made a difference." Emma returned the smile, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Mildred and others like her deserve to be treated with respect. "I couldn't stand by and do nothing." As she continued her rounds, Emma felt a new sense of purpose. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she was committed to making Glenview Medical a place where every patient felt valued and cared for. With Dr. Keene's departure, the atmosphere at Glenview Medical gradually began to change. Emma noticed a renewed focus on patient-centered care, with the hospital administration implementing new policies to ensure patients received the attention and respect they deserved. Emma continued to visit Mildred regularly, cherishing the bond they had built over time. Mildred's health was improving, and her spirits were higher than Emma had ever seen. One evening, as Emma was helping Mildred settle in for the night, the elderly woman reached out and took her hand. "Emma, I want you to know how grateful I am. You've given me so much more than just care. You've given me hope." Emma's heart swelled with emotion, and she squeezed Mildred's hand gently. "It's been an honor to care for you, Mrs. Grant, and thank you for giving me the strength to do what was right." As Emma left Mildred's room that night, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had stood up for her beliefs, defended the dignity of her patients, and contributed to meaningful change. It was a victory that went beyond any personal gain. It was a victory for compassion, kindness, and the belief that every life mattered. Months had passed since Dr. Keene's departure from Glenview Medical, and with time, the hospital had begun to embrace a new culture of care. Emma had witnessed a gradual but meaningful transformation within the institution, one that valued compassion alongside medical expertise. The administration implemented new training sessions focusing on empathy, patient dignity, and communication, core principles that had become the heart of Emma's work. Emma had become somewhat of a mentor to the younger nurses and interns who joined the team. She often shared her experiences and taught them how to approach each patient as an individual with unique needs and fears. She reminded them of the importance of listening, of being present, and of treating each person with the respect they deserved. On a quiet afternoon, she was approached by a young intern named Jake, who had recently started his rotations in patient care. He looked hesitant as he pulled Emma aside in the hallway. "Nurse Collins," he began, his voice soft but sincere. "I just wanted to thank you. I've heard about what you did for Mrs. Grant and for all the patients here. It's inspiring. I want to be the kind of nurse who cares like that, too." Emma smiled warmly, feeling a rush of pride. "Thank you, Jake. Remember, caring for our patients is about more than just the procedures. It's about seeing them, hearing them, and making sure they know they're valued. Every patient is someone's loved one, and they deserve to be treated like it." Jake nodded, and Emma saw a new resolve in his eyes. It was moments like these that reassured her she'd made the right choices, even if they'd been difficult. She had planted seeds of change that were taking root, and it filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. One sunny afternoon, Emma was surprised to receive a visitor at Glenview Medical, Mildred's daughter, Teresa. Emma hadn't seen Teresa in months, not since Mildred's transfer to a rehabilitation center closer to family. Mildred had written Emma a heartfelt letter before she left, expressing her gratitude for Emma's kindness and care. Emma had missed her presence, but knowing Mildred was closer to family had brought her peace. Teresa greeted Emma with a warm hug, her eyes misty as she held Emma's hands. "I just wanted to thank you in person, Emma. My mother speaks about you often, how you stood up for her, and how you gave her a reason to smile during some of her hardest days." Emma felt a lump in her throat. "Your mother is an incredible woman, Teresa. I learned so much from her. She taught me the value of patience, resilience, and kindness, even in the face of challenges. Teresa nodded, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. Because of you, she believes in people again. You showed her that there are still good people in this world, people who genuinely care. Emma placed a comforting hand on Teresa's shoulder. Your mother gave me just as much. Tell her she'll always have a place in my heart. Teresa's eyes shone with gratitude. She handed Emma a small wrapped box, a gift from Mildred. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with the words, "Thank you for seeing me." Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek as she read the words, her heart swelling with emotion. It was a simple message, but it held the weight of everything she'd fought for. As time went on, Emma's dedication to her patients didn't go unnoticed by the administration. The hospital board saw her commitment to compassionate care as a valuable asset, and soon, they offered her a position leading a new patient advocacy program. The program was designed to give every patient a voice and ensure that their needs, concerns, and dignity were always prioritized. Emma accepted the role with both pride and humility. She knew it was a chance to make an even larger impact on the hospital, one that would honor the legacy of people like Mildred, who had inspired her journey. Her first initiative was to establish a Patient Dignity Council, a small team of nurses, social workers, and volunteers dedicated to checking in with patients regularly and addressing any concerns that might be overlooked. Emma encouraged her team to take time with each patient, to get to know them beyond their medical charts, and to remind them that they mattered. As Emma led her team, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a nurse. She was an advocate, a champion for those who might feel unheard or unseen. The council became a model for patient-centered care, inspiring similar programs across the hospital network. Emma knew that this was only the beginning, but she was proud of how far they had come. Several months later, Emma received a call from Teresa, who invited her to Mildred's 88th birthday celebration. Emma accepted the invitation eagerly, thrilled at the chance to reunite with her former patient. The celebration was held at a cozy community center, filled with family, friends, and loved ones who had gathered to celebrate Mildred's life. As Emma entered the room, she spotted Mildred in the center, surrounded by laughter and love. When their eyes met, Mildred's face lit up with a warm smile, and Emma felt her heart swell with joy. She approached, and Mildred reached out, her hands steady as they held Emma's. "Oh, Emma," Mildred said, her voice filled with emotion. "You came!" Emma leaned in, giving her a gentle hug. "Of course, Mrs. Grant. I wouldn't miss this for the world." They spent the afternoon talking, sharing memories, and laughing together. Mildred shared stories from her life, filling Emma in on everything she'd missed since their last meeting. Emma listened, feeling grateful for this moment of connection and friendship. Before leaving, Mildred took Emma's hands once more. "Emma, I want you to know that you've given me the greatest gift. You saw me when no one else did. You made me feel valued, like I was worth fighting for." Emma felt a lump in her throat as she replied, her voice soft. "Thank you, Mrs. Grant. Knowing you has changed my life. You taught me so much about kindness and strength. I'll carry those lessons with me always." As Emma left the celebration, she felt a sense of closure and peace. Mildred had been a source of strength and inspiration, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. Their bond was one she would treasure forever. In the months following Mildred's celebration, Emma continued her work with unwavering dedication. The patient advocacy program flourished, and the hospital saw marked improvements in patient satisfaction and overall morale. Her program became a model of compassionate care that was eventually adopted by other hospitals in the area. Emma often reflected on her journey, the struggles, the victories, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She knew she had found her calling, and she embraced it with a heart full of gratitude and purpose. The small silver bracelet Mildred had given her became Emma's constant reminder of her mission. Every time she looked at it, she thought of the message engraved on it. "Thank you for seeing me." It was a daily affirmation of the impact she had made and the lives she had touched. Years later, as Emma walked through the halls of Glenview Medical, now a respected leader in patient advocacy. She often caught glimpses of young nurses who reminded her of herself when she first started. She took every opportunity to mentor them, sharing the lessons she had learned and encouraging them to bring kindness and compassion into their work. One day, as she was heading home, she stopped by her office to grab her things. She looked around, taking in the photos on the walls, the thank you notes from patients, and the small plant on her desk, a gift from Mildred's daughter, Teresa. Emma smiled, feeling the warmth of a life well lived and a career built on kindness and integrity. As she walked out into the evening, Emma felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had made a difference, one patient at a time, and she knew that she would continue to carry the legacy of compassion wherever she went. As Emma walked out into the warm evening air, she felt fulfilled, carrying the memories of every patient who had touched her life. Mildred's words echoed in her heart, a reminder of why she'd chosen this path. Thank you for seeing me. Emma knew she'd continue to make a difference, one patient at a time, inspiring others to bring kindness into their work. And if this story inspired you too, if you believe in the power of compassion and standing up for what's right, don't forget to subscribe. Join us as we share more stories of courage, resilience, and the impact one person can make. There's always room for more kindness in the world. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness make the biggest difference.